Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at a game which I played against the Grandmaster Ivanisevic. The game features the Semi-Slav opening and begins with the move pawn to d4 with me handling the white pieces. Black replied knight to f6, pawn to c4, and now the move pawn to e6. And by the way, it is my opinion that this is the strongest reply Black has available to the move d4, the queen's pawn opening. The idea is that if White continues with the natural move knight to c3, Black has access to a pin with the move bishop to b4, thereby preventing the move e2 to e4, and also threatening in certain circumstances to double the c-pawns with the move bishop takes c3 check. This position has done quite well for Black and is known as the Nimzo Indian opening. Now, of course, White still has plenty of options available here and chances of the advantage, but in practice, it has become slightly more popular for White to play the move knight to f3, as I did in the game. Now, Black has access to a few different options here. One option would be the move pawn to b6, known as the Queen's Indian, and the idea here would be to continue clamping down on the e4 square, thereby preventing the move e2 to e4 with a later bishop to b7 here. Another option would be c5, leading to Benoni positions. But in the game, Black again played what I would consider to be the strongest move available by continuing with the move pawn to d5, transposing into the Queen's Gambit declined. Now, the benefit of going into the Queen's Gambit declined in this way is that White has already committed a tempo to bringing his knight to the f3 square, and this has the effect of preventing White from achieving the Carlsbad variation. Let me explain that again. If Black were to use the more common move order to reach the Queen's Gambit declined, which would be pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, the Queen's Gambit, and now pawn to e6, the Queen's Gambit declined, if Black were to use this move order, White could now continue with knight to c3, and now on the move knight to f6, White has access to a very strong option known as the Carlsbad variation with the moves pawn takes pawn on d5, pawn takes pawn on d5, and now bishop to g5. Now, White has already accumulated a small advantage here by way of having the 2-to-1 pawn majority in the center. But one of the most important advantages which White retains in this position is that Black will have difficulty deploying his light squared bishop. The reason for this is that if at any time, such as now, Black brings out the bishop to the f5 square, White can immediately make use of the tactical pressure on d5 as well as the weakness of the b7 pawn by playing moves such as queen to b3. In this position, White could simply play bishop takes f6 immediately. And now after g takes f6, which would of course damage the pawn structure, White could also win a pawn with the move queen to b3. A somewhat less destructive example of this same point happens if Black were to play bishop to e7, defending against the threat of bishop takes f6. And now after pawn to e3, once again, Black cannot play the move bishop to f5. And the reason for this is that White would have access to the move bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now queen to b3, attacking both the pawn on d5 and the newly abandoned pawn on b7, and thereby winning a pawn. Now, how does the move order selected in the game prevent this option for White? After the moves pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to f3, pawn to d5, all as played in the game, now White has spent an important, critical tempo bringing his knight out to the f3 square. Therefore, if he goes for the Carlsbad variation with the moves pawn takes pawn on d5, pawn takes pawn on d5, Black will actually find that he has time to deploy the bishop to the f5 square. For example, after the moves bishop to g5, pawn to c6, and now let us say knight to c3, bishop to e7. Now it does not matter if white plays queen to c2 or pawn to e3. In both cases, black will be able to bring his bishop out to the f5 square. In the case of queen to c2, black would have access to the move pawn to g6. White could then play pawn to e3, bishop to f5 would be played, bishop d3, and now black would achieve a coveted exchange of his light squared bishop, which usually turns out to be his most problematic piece, and in fact, black actually has a plus score in this position. Now you may be wondering, what happens if white plays the move queen to c2 earlier? In all cases, black will always have access to the move pawn to g6, and this will always be related to the fact that white spent a tempo on knight f3 rather than on bringing his knight to c3 and playing the move pawn to e3 and being able to bring the queen or the bishop to the diagonal before black has a chance to bring the bishop to f5. And that's as much as we're going to say about this right now. So going back to the position in the game, I continued with the move knight to c3. And now, once again, black has a few different options available. He can actually, at this time, bring his bishop to b4, or he can play bishop to e7, playing in a more standard Queen's Gambit declined fashion. But the move chosen by my opponent in this game was the move pawn to c6, leading to the position known as the Semi-Slav variation. Black's idea in the Semi-Slav is that he creates the immediate threat of pawn takes pawn on c4 by virtue of 2 points, which were helped by the move pawn to c6. Since black has played the move pawn to c6, he is now ready to play pawn to b5 as a means of supporting the pawn on c4. For example, after one of the key moves here, bishop to g5, which was not played in the game, black has access to the move pawn takes pawn on c4, whereupon, after the move pawn to e4, black is able to support the c4 pawn with b7 to b5, and this is made directly possible by the fact that black has included the move c7 to c6. Another way for black to exploit this same opportunity of capturing on c4 is to first insert the moves pawn to h6, and now if white plays the move bishop to h4, which is a popular option, once again, black can play pawn takes pawn on c4, and now after e4, black inserts the move pawn to g5, kicking the bishop, bishop to g3, and now, once again, b7 to b5, a move which is facilitated by the pawn's position on c6. This is one of the key ideas which black is playing for in the Semi-Slav variation. To explain that one more time, after black has played the move pawn to c6, he has now created a threat of pawn takes pawn on c4, followed by b7 to b5. And it's this point which is the reason for white's next move played in the game, pawn to e3. Now, if you take a look at the position, you'll see that this is a slight merit for black here, that white has already had to box in his dark squared bishop. And in this game, the positioning of the dark squared bishop ends up being such an important factor that I eventually sacrifice a pawn in order to liberate this bishop. This is one of the ideas of the Semi-Slav variation. And another point to look at here is that the pawns in the center are exactly symmetrical. Since black has forced white to play the move pawn to e3, or else he would lose a pawn, white now has no preponderance in the center except for the fact that his pawn on c4 is slightly better placed than the pawn on c6, and this is the basis of white's advantage thus far in the position. We'll see how this all plays out throughout the game. Now black continued with the standard move, knight b to d7. From here, white has two options available. He can play the immediate bishop to d3, or he can first insert the move queen to c2, as I did in the game. Black now played bishop to d6, still a standard reply. I continued bishop to d3. Black castled kingside. White castled kingside. And now it's time for black to search for an active plan. Once again in this position, there are only a couple factors which differ between the differing armies. White's knight is on c3, whereas black's knight is on d7. This is an advantage to white. White's pawn is on c4, whereas black's pawn is on c6. This is a slight advantage to white. However, black aims to alleviate these difficulties as quickly as possible with the plan pawn takes pawn on c4 as played in the game, bishop takes c4, and now the entire point from here on is to achieve eventually the move pawn to c5 in such a way as to equalize the pawn structure. In the game, black continued with the move pawn to a6. I really like this move. Another popular option would be the move pawn to b5, but first, black simply played the move pawn to a6. The idea is black will eventually kick the bishop with b5. He will then bring his bishop out to b7, and then he will start looking for the c5 pawn break. From here, I continued with the move rook to d1, and black now struck out with b7 to b5. The bishop retreated to e2 so as not to block the rook on d1, and now black continued queen to c7. Already, black is beginning to generate a little bit of pressure in this position. White continued with the move pawn to e4, threatening e5, and now my opponent continued with the move pawn to e5. White already needs to concern himself with the possibility of an exchange of pawns on the d4 square, since now if the knight were to recapture, the pawn on h2 would be hanging. And if the rook were to recapture, as it must do in this position, White would probably find himself quite vulnerable to an eventual move pawn to c5 or bishop to e5 or some variation thereof. Therefore, one of the options white has available is the move pawn to h3, simply removing the h-pawn from the h2 square, so that now, if black captures pawn takes pawn on d4, white can use the knight to recapture. However, having been familiar with some of the motifs in this position, I instead played the move pawn to g3 instead of pawn to h3, and this might look a little unusual at first. But the idea is that it is crucial for white to make use of the advantage that he has in the position in the center preponderance. Currently, white has 2-to-1 pawns in the center. His hopes of achieving an attack are based on his ability to advance these pawns up the board. And by opening with the move pawn to g3, white is making it possible at a later moment to achieve the move f2 to f4, which could definitely come in handy. Black now replied with the move rook to e8. Again, black is beginning to develop some serious pressure in this position. If it were black's move once again, black would already have the option of pawn takes pawn on d4, and now if knight takes d4, pawn to b4, attacking the knight, white would already have to be looking at what is he going to do about the pawn on the e4 square. So it's crucial to realize that black is already generating quite a bit of counterplay, quite a bit of pressure. Now to avoid this motif of pawn takes pawn on d4 followed by pawn to b4, I continued with the move a2 to a3, simply preventing b4. And there is a second point to this move. We have talked about the fact that black would like to bring his bishop to b7 and then bring this pawn to c5. Well, by playing the move a2 to a3, white is actually making it possible to continue with the move b2 to b4 at a later moment, thereby making it more difficult for black to achieve the move c6 to c5. And this was also one of the ideas that I had in mind when I played the move a2 to a3. Now black continued with pawn takes pawn on d4. I recaptured knight takes pawn on d4. and black continued bishop to b7. Now from here I fairly quickly played the move knight to f5, attacking the bishop, but after black replied bishop to e5, I began to doubt my position just a little bit here. Black is already threatening to play bishop takes knight on c3, followed by capturing rook takes on e4. Now the most natural way to defend the pawn on e4 would be the move bishop to f3, since now if black continues with the moves bishop takes c3 and queen takes c3, black cannot play knight takes e4, as this would lead to an immediate disaster with queen takes pawn on g7, checkmate. And therefore, with the move bishop to f3, white will have solved the problem of the e4 pawn. However, this position looked a little bit shaky to me, since it looked as though black would be able to kick the knight on f5. The knight would need to position itself on h6 or to retreat on e3. And in either case, I wasn't quite sure what white is doing here. It actually turns out that this position has been played a few times in the Mega database and in one game by the Grandmaster Akopian versus Aronian. In these games, white actually still continued with the move bishop to g5, and then later retreated the bishop to g2 and played for the f2 to f4 move, which is so critical in this position. And it turns out that this is quite a valid way for white to continue playing, and in fact, he has a plus score in this position. However, being unaware of this idea, I didn't like the positioning of my knight on h6 and the bishop on g5, and I'm not even quite sure if I considered bishop to g5. Instead, I wasn't really sure on how to create play in this position, but after quite a bit of thought, I played a pawn sacrifice here with the move pawn to f4. And this move actually received quite a bit of praise after the game and throughout the tournament, but in fact I'm not at all convinced that it's the best move for white. However, it is quite an interesting, dynamic, and practical opportunity. The idea is black captured bishop takes c3. I recaptured queen takes c3, gaining the bishop pair. And now, of course, once again, if knight takes e4, white has checkmate available on g7, and therefore, instead, black played rook takes e4. I saved my bishop with tempo with bishop f3, and now after rook e6, it was time to play the move pawn to b4, which was prepared earlier with a3. My idea in this position was to fight for full compensation of the pawn by keeping the pawn on c6 backwards and utilizing the bishop pair to create pressure on the king. And this actually worked out quite well in the game. At the very least, it sets black some interesting practical problems. Black continued quite well by bringing his rook to e8, doubling rooks on the e-file. Now from here I would like to play the move bishop to b2, but I was none too thrilled about the possibility of the rook coming to e3. This is kind of a strange move which I played, but I did play the move knight to d4, first trying to break up these rooks a bit. Black continued rook to d6, and I now played the move bishop to b2, feeling pretty good about my position since I'm close to playing knight f5 and creating some pressure along the long diagonal. Now from here, black continued with the excellent move queen to b6, simply pinning the knight on d4 and setting the question of what I am to do in this position. This was already a difficult moment for white, since if I'm not careful, let's say king to h1, the move pawn to c5 could be absolutely deadly. For example, let's say knight to f5, and now this was a key point to be aware of in this position. There is the possibility of the rook coming to the e2 square after pawn takes pawn on b4, attacking the queen, pawn takes pawn on b4, and now rook to e2, and this is extremely menacing. The idea being that black is quickly threatening to play the move queen to f2, and he's also threatening to play the move rook takes b2 or bishop takes f3, followed by rook takes b2, and this would be decisive. Therefore, having sensed that this threat, this idea of rook e2 was available, rather than bringing the king to the h1 square, I brought the king to the f1 square as a way of bringing the knight out of the pin. Black continued, pawn to c5. I continued knight to f5. An exchange of rooks took place on d1, followed by an exchange of bishops on f3. And now black would have had an advantage had he simply continued with pawn takes pawn on b4, pawn takes pawn on b4, and queen to e6. In this position, black is still ahead of pawn, though it may not count for too much. White's king is a little bit exposed, and the position is a little bit better for black. However, in the game, black simply played the move queen to e6 instead, and this turned out to be quite favorable for white, since the pawn on c5 actually turned out to be hanging under certain conditions, and I was able to recover the pawn. White continued, knight to d6, attacking the rook. A check was given. King to g1. And now the rook had some difficulty about where to place itself. Ivanisevic played rook to d8, and now I played knight to b7. The rook came back to e8, and of course, not minding a draw with such a strong player, I continued knight to d6. And now from here, black started to really go downhill. Black continued with the move rook to e7, attempting to avoid the draw, but allowing the move. Bishop takes f6, which forced black to reply with g takes f6, since if knight takes f6, queen to a8 check will win material and the game at once. So black continued, g takes f6. Now white was able to play the move pawn takes pawn on c5, recovering the pawn, since if black were to play knight takes c5, the move queen to a8 check, followed by king to g7, knight e8 check, king g6, and queen to d8 would also be very strong for white. Therefore, black was unable to recapture the pawn, and white definitely had begun to accumulate a small advantage here. In fact, after the move rook to e7, as was played in the game, and after the exchange which took place on f6, followed by pawn takes pawn on c5, white already has a decisive advantage, as black has pressed a little bit too hard, damaged his pawn structure, returned the pawn, and the pawn on c5 is quite a valuable asset. But it was only after some inaccuracies by both sides that white, being me in this case, actually managed to win the game, and in that case also gained my highest rated victory. The purpose of this game from the opening standpoint was to demonstrate the Semi-Slav. We were able to see some of the subtleties which affected the Queen's Gambit decline transposition, and then we were able to take a look at the Semi-Slav structures and to see just how readily black is able to create counterplay in this opening. I hope you've enjoyed the look at this game, and that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.